issues, I'd like to welcome you to this Bruegel online event. Bruegel normally holds about 80 to 90 physical events in Brussels every year. We've moved our entire program online, and I'm happy to say we're actually holding more events online than we historically held offline. One of our attendees here in the corner with the Bruegel logo is Katja, a staffer who backs us up on these things. She's going crazy with the number of events that we hold. In any case, I'd encourage you to look at our events page and keep an eye on things because we hold a lot of interesting events. Now, for me, I'm happy to say this is the first time since the crisis that I have the pleasure of moderating a panel that's not mainly about COVID-19. It's a pleasant change. Our topic for today relates to an interest in creating a European-based mobile operating environment for smartphones, tablets, and such. As most of you will be aware, in Europe, most people have smartphones or tablets that are based on one of two operating environments, either an environment based on Google's Android or else on Apple's iOS. In the past months, there's been a strong interest, largely driven by Huawei, to create an alternative to these, but one that would enable Android applications to run, still based on some kind of cooperative venture with European companies and essentially European-based, even though it would have a target market of the entire world. So, so this is really what the topic for today is about. I know we have lots of discussions about intellectual property migrating from the Western democracies to China. It's sort of novel to have a discussion where the flow might be in the opposite direction, but it raises many questions for us. Now, just to clarify though, I've been talking about operating environment. There's an Android operating system, there's an iOS operating system for Apple devices. There are also lots of things that are part of the broader ecosystem, a whole range of applications, some of which are closely bound to the operating system, software developer kit. How much that actually plays into this is, I think, an open discussion, and it's one that our Huawei speaker will be telling us a little bit more about, I hope. So that's really where we're going to be going today. The discussion has largely been driven by Huawei, mainly as a response to export restrictions that were imposed by the United States. But it has implications for Europe, some of which good, some of which might not be. This is a discussion for today. That's why we've got a really excellent, diverse panel to look at the issues. And there are issues of EU industrial policy and digital sovereignty. There are issues of competition. There are issues of security of supply. And there could be issues of cybersecurity. It's hard to have a discussion with Huawei where cybersecurity doesn't come into the discussion. So for all of those, I'm looking forward to hearing from the panel. Now, we have the opportunity to take questions from the audience. There is a Slido. If you simply bring up sli.do in your browser and use mobile as a hashtag, you'll be able to pose questions. You can also like questions that other people have chosen. I'll be looking at the feed. I'll be paying probably more attention to the ones that get a lot of likes. So keep that in mind. And I'll try to pick and choose among the questions that come in as we get to the later portions of the session. The session should go about an hour. I've asked the speakers to keep their remarks to not more than about 7 minutes, which should leave us plenty of time for questions. And again, for the panel, we have a very diverse panel that I think will give us a mix of views. We've got Andreas Zimmer, who is a Huawei employee and will be speaking first to tell us a bit about what they have in mind, how they hope this is going to work. Next will be Hosuke Lee Makiyama, who's a director at ESIPE. He'll be talking about competition issues, maybe security issues. Renato Nazzini, who's a partner at LMS Legal, I think also faculty at London School, correct? London School of Economics.
King's College, this is very important because it's a competition. King's College London. So.
Oh, excuse me. And also Peter Stuckmann, who's head of unit on future connectivity systems for DG Connect at the European Commission. So hopefully we'll be getting a good mix of views on what we should like about the proposal and anything that we shouldn't like about the proposal. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the first time I've seen a public discussion on this topic, so I'm quite looking forward to it. Okay, and with that, Andreas, over to you. Let's say around 7 minutes. Try to tell us what's going on here and what might happen.
Very well, cool. Thank you very much, Scott. So I'll try my best to keep a very technical discussion as high level and non-technically as possible. So I mean, the first question obviously is why is Huawei even part of a discussion on European on a European-based operating an ecosystem? And the fact of the matter is that at the moment Huawei is a very interesting case study on the impact of US technology on European consumers. And that is basically why we are very interested in this topic. So you might have heard that since May 2019, Huawei has been impacted by a decision made in the US that has created some uncertainty for our company, our partners, and our consumers. Huawei at the moment is a very significant part of the European consumer electronics environment. So that's quite important to note. So we grew in Europe from a very low single-digit market share into 22%, actually end of last year. So 22%, which means almost a quarter of every smartphone sold in the European Union is actually a Huawei smartphone. So this becomes a very interesting kind of topic for European consumers, and therefore I think also from a policy perspective. Now the core of the issue basically is we've been working with Google for a long time, so we consider ourselves a core strategic partner of Google. And Google is no longer allowed to supply us with the necessary license that allows us to use the Google-based Android operating system. Instead, we are using the Android open source project. And I'll give a little bit more context on what this means to you now. So basically, the process is that usually an OEM, so an original equipment manufacturer like Huawei, building smartphones, Samsung, HTC, LG are also OEMs. They submit devices and software builds to Google for checking and to obtain the Google license, basically. And as of 16th of May 2019, new devices that Huawei has launched are not legally allowed to receive those licenses anymore, and at least without U.S. government approval, which has not happened yet. So the consequences are essentially that devices that Huawei has launched post May 16th no longer have Google Play. So consumers can no longer access the Google Play Store on these Huawei devices. Instead, Huawei provides the Huawei App Gallery, which is also an app store. Essentially, it's the third largest platform globally. And for developers of applications, Android applications, this also bears some consequences, most notably that some Google proprietary APIs that are part of something that's called Google Play Services are no longer available to these developers on Huawei devices, which means that they need to make adjustments. An example of this is embedded maps within an application or notifications. Those no longer work using the Google APIs, so they need to use other APIs. And the third consequence for consumers, again, is that the Google apps are not pre-installed anymore on Huawei devices. Therefore, consumers need to find alternative ways to access these services, for example, through the web, as an example. Yeah. So what has Huawei done given this situation? So this, as I said, happened in May last year. So it's pretty much been 1 year. We've focused heavily, obviously, on promoting App Gallery as a source for safe downloads of Android applications. We've deployed a number of developer tools, so-called HMS Core, which allows developers to embed core functions into their applications instead of the Google APIs. And we've worked also very closely with a large number of European organizations, partnering up to deliver services. Companies like Quant, that is providing some search capabilities, TomTom, that is providing a Maps API for developers, Avast, which we use for security on the devices, WorldPay for payments. We're obviously working with network operators as well. So we're trying to do business continuity, but with a very strong focus on Europe. Now, obviously, this whole episode had a huge impact on our employees, their families, but also consumers and developers, as we just heard, because we consider operating systems quite generally to be platforms, right? So at the moment, as Scott mentioned, for smartphones, there are two platforms. One is Android, which had globally approximately a market share of 85%, and iOS, which has a 15% market share. So you see, it's quite a duopoly there. For tablets, it's a little bit more balanced. We have 60% market share Android. We have around 28% market share for iOS, and then there's also some Windows tablets as well. Some key thing that these platforms have in common is that they're based on some form of proprietary technology that is used to kind of control the platform for various reasons, in addition to controlling the distribution of applications, which is obviously a business model attached to that. So there's a 30% revenue share that these companies usually take from developers of applications to have their apps distributed through their respective channels. Yeah. On the other side of the same coin, the cloud services that power these applications and the cloud services that power the infrastructure behind it is also very heavily biased towards US technology companies. So we see a notable absence of European technology companies actually in this space, whether it be on the operating system to consumer side or to developer side. And we think that European sovereignty should strive for independence from US technology there, and digital sovereignty should push for a better integration within Europe. And I think a very interesting case in point, and maybe it's the last time we notice it, but we noticed it today, but the COVID-19 discussion actually plays into that, because it shows how dependent Europe is on these US technology platforms for a very real problem today, and we don't really have a solution yet. So maybe to close these remarks then, just some brief thoughts on implications for European policy here. I mean, in the short term, I think Europe needs to strive for more independent decision-making in this space. And the long term is obviously ecosystem enablement within Europe through the use of independent platforms. And that leads us to a very interesting key question that I hope that we will be able to discuss in greater detail today, which is, what should such a platform actually look like? And I want to throw into the ring sort of three considerations that we, from Huawei's point of view, think are important for such a platform. So the first one, obviously, is that it's future-proof, and future-proof in terms of taking into account future and current requirements from developers and from users, because the platforms that we're currently using with Android and iOS are a phone platform. So iOS has been around since 2007, Android has been around since 2008. So we see that those are built for a different reality than we see today, because our future in Europe, as globally, is built around 5G, right? Everyone has heard this discussion that 5G is going to enable many new sort of applications for digital technology in everyday life. So the new platform should be enabled for 5G, and it should be a seamless multi-device support, because we all have more devices, right? Nowadays, we don't just have a smartphone anymore. We don't just have a tablet. We have a connected watch. We have a connected smart home to that. So there is a multi-device reality that the consumer is facing, and the platform should cater to this. Secondly, something that Europe excels at is privacy and security. So we think that the platform should be should contain privacy and security by design. Again, this is something that the smartphone platforms themselves basically have bolted on afterwards, more or less, if you will. I think the new platform can actually be built around privacy and security at its very core. And thirdly, we think that free open standards as well as open source is the way to go in order to do this, in order to alleviate any concerns around privacy and security, of course, as well, but also to decentralize the control for the operating system, as well as making it possible for European developers to contribute to the system openly and widely. So ultimately, we plead for promoting more choice, not only for device manufacturers, but also for consumers, for developers, and technology enablers. And we think that the core of this should be in Europe. So that's it from me.
Thanks, Andreas. So key takeaways, I guess, on the goals then are future-proof, privacy and security integrated, and open source. It's an interesting message. Okay, well, with that, I'd like to hand over to Hozuk, give him an opportunity to provide some initial remarks. Again, if you could aim for about 5 to 7 minutes, that would be appreciated. And so what do you think about this? What do you see as the things that we should welcome? Are there things we shouldn't welcome so much? Are there some where there are just plain uncertainties? Over to you, Hozuk.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you so much for inviting me today. And welcome and not welcome. I think on an open market, everybody should get a fair chance. But I want to start on a different note. Why was this OS necessarily? I mean, we heard a little bit around the entity listing, and I want to start off by saying that, yes, sure. I mean, as much as I welcome Huawei or anyone to develop any product, I think it's we should establish the fact that this is an innovation by necessity because of the entity listing. And therefore, it's also a product of that geopolitical context that we are in right now, which is really difficult to avoid. And I want to start off by basically presenting both sides of the argument of the cybersecurity debate. And maybe start off by saying that Huawei has a very big product portfolio. And I'm pretty sure that depending on what your politics are, you're going to have concerns with some, but not the others. And let me start by saying that, if you look at US issue with the network equipment, and it's very often written off as protectionism. And we very often forget also at the same time the United States doesn't actually make network equipment. There is actually not a single vendor of RAN networks in the United States. So it's a case that is difficult to make. Now let's move that conversation to Europe. Do we share the security parameters and the thinking or the paradigm of the United States? Some does, some don't. Some have absolutely zero geopolitical footprint in Asia to be worried about. Other people have other concerns. We heard privacy, for example. So it's very important to bear in mind that, well, if you look at on one side, yeah, sure, there is a global competition, for example, in areas like AI and semiconductors. Why? Because they are more or less dual use products. If you can develop a semiconductor to calculate all the calculations that are necessary, let's say, to recognize my voice in my phone, same processor is going to be used to shoot down a fighter jet against a J-21 and an F-35 in midair. So basically, the faster processor you have, more fighting capabilities do you have on the battlefield today. So I can certainly understand that point. But also we need to bear in mind that in the United States right now, it's actually the mirror of Europe in the sense that actually Chinese company can take data out of the United States. There's nothing that stops TikTok from actually harvesting data on American citizens and bringing it back for processing in China, because that's the open data model that the United States happen to believe in. And at the same time, you can't take data out of China. So in one sense, we are talking about IP in the introduction. Yeah, sure, you can take tech out, but you can actually take a lot of raw data out of the United States if you have the right app or if you have the right hardware. And I think also in this context, it is very important to bear in mind that entity listing moves the decision-making from a commercial vendor. Google might see itself as a competitor to Huawei and just suddenly decide to stop supplying the kit tomorrow. Actually, there are contractual issues there between Chinese government and Google, I believe, but that has been settled and which you can read about. But in short, it makes it actually a political decision whether Google products can be licensed by Huawei or not. And here's where I come down on the question around the operating system side. I think I'm actually pretty sure that the United States government and other people who are observers in China and the whole bifurcation debate, where the OS actually sits. Is it as something that, to paraphrase LB Johnson, would it be better to actually bring Huawei inside the tent to keep it within the ecosphere of Google, or do we want them outside the tent? But in either case, I have actually, unlike Renato, I am actually from LSE, and but I have also, I would jokingly say that I also have a business degree from Kissinger School of Business and Realpolitik. And here's where I come down to the point that you can probably not do an embargo against China. China currently accounts for 50% of all the global app downloads, has some of the best programmers in the world, and it's able to scale domestically under one single unified language. So therefore, is it possible in the long run to actually isolate China? Probably not. And here's where the reality comes down to really, is that for a perspective of a company like Huawei, if you can't really access a market, for example, like a platform market, because you're actually blocked from using it, in the long run, at some point, Huawei and Google is going to have different business objectives. At that point, if you have been cut loose, you have no choice but to develop on your own. And in a sense, you could even say that if you don't have access to the market, it might just as well undermine the market. Let me explain. Huawei had another brilliant business idea to license its IP to whoever it wanted in the United States. Why does that make sense? Why does it make sense to give it away to the United States? Simply because they don't have access to it. If it's a revenue pocket for your competitors, why don't just, you can just as well destroy that market. And I'm not saying that in a negative sense, but I'm just saying that from a business perspective, it makes perfect sense to go after someone else's pockets of revenue. This is what the Americans as well as European business have been doing for all the time. Now, bringing the question about, does it have a trade implication to have a Chinese open source platform vendor or operating system in Europe? I'm not so sure, partly because Europe has already left actually the device market. We have a few insignificant OEM licensing of legacy brands, but we don't actually have a viable manufactured devices aside from the niche market. And you could also argue that, if you want to get into this ecosphere, operating systems were not the market entry barrier, as we heard. If you wanted to license the OS, you could do that. The only really license barrier you had was if you wanted to have iOS. You couldn't really license that. You have to really play by the rules. And you could also equally argue that if we want to use OS as an offensive strategy, for example, against China, tapping into this huge market, I would even argue here that the App Store divide is not the problem. It's not because we don't have access to app stores that we can't access the Chinese market. The MATA basic concept is really not the market barrier. There's a whole list of licensing requirements that you need to oblige to if you want to have access to the Chinese app market. And this is where I come back to the question around the key question that you posed in the beginning. Is this a competition issue? Yes and no. If we had, let's say, a Huawei player on the market when DG Comp actually issued the SO, would it have changed the Commission's assessment of the market? Absolutely not. First of all, I would argue that one, it was a politicized case. Second, they defined the relevant product market in a way that Google was its own market. It could have had 1%, 10%, 20%, or 100% of the market. It wouldn't have mattered because it had already 100% of the Android market. The Commission saw actually the Android as its own market. There's a number of complications of this, whether we see vertical or horizontal market integration as more sensitive or not. But the key question, I think, is this, that we just can't acknowledge the fact that there is a dynamic competition in the tech sphere. So right now we have an Android dominance. 10 years ago, it was Windows. And you can really see a parallel to what was happening in the music market. We did a number of cases against Windows music player, not understanding that the competition would come from somewhere else. It was iTunes. iTunes was then dethroned by Spotify. And probably the guys who are going to dethrone Google is not going to follow Google's business model. And that's the model of dynamic competition. Much of the world has acknowledged it, but Europe tends to protect competitors, not necessarily competition. We have one more issue in terms of competition that maybe Renato will talk more about as well, which is basically the question about commercial essential patents and standards essential patents. We are now seeing two groups of companies that has basically form-based patents, design patents, basically. We have Apple there, and on the other side, we have standard essential patents, which is basically legacy players in the telecom business. Huawei will probably have access to both. And another point is that we will have a number of players where we can take out legal injunctions against. And Huawei will be one of them, simply because we can't take a legal case against China for a number of reasons that I can explain later in the Q&A. So in this sense, I think the impact of having a Chinese OS player or Huawei in this market is very much a product of the security context that we are discussing this, but also most importantly, perhaps business. Thank you.
Thanks, Jose. So I'm sure that Andreas will have some things he wants to say to that, but I'd prefer that we actually make the round of the speakers so that everyone has a chance first. And with that, I'd like to turn over the floor to Professor Renato Nazzini, who, among other things, is a partner at LMS Legal. And I'm sure since you also deal with competition issues and with many of the other topics here, you'll have your own views, and I'd like to hear them. If you could keep to about 7 minutes, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Scott. I will. And as you say, I will come from a kind of competition policy perspective, which is very, very much my field. And starting off by saying that when we talk about competition policy, we have to understand exactly what we are talking about. And I think it's fair to say that competition policy means different things in different places and to different people. So competition policy in the United States, for example, is very much focused on the welfare of the consumer, on whether conduct, agreements, projects, innovation, and so on benefits consumers. Whereas in the European Union, the focus is much more on keeping markets open, ensuring we have a level playing field in case anybody wants to compete or comes into a market, to give anybody a fair opportunity to compete. And, you know, wearing my kind of King's College professor hat, I'm clearly oversimplifying here. And then there are other policies as well that come into the mix, obviously, especially nowadays. Nowadays, there are people, politicians, even academic colleagues who would like to see competition policy as the theory of everything, that which will solve all problems in society, from inequality to cybersecurity to and so on and so forth. And one thing I'll pick up on this first, because Andreas said something interesting at the beginning. Then this new operating system, which is of course a new source of competition. It's one more competitor in the landscape, so it's more competition here, but it's also important because of European digital sovereignty, etc. Well, I do think it's a little bit far-fetched to look at this Huawei project as giving Europe actually a digital sovereignty. It's on the one hand, it is absolutely true that currently the landscape is dominated by global players who were born, so to speak, in the United States. Huawei is certainly not a European player either. So I don't think if we do have an issue of European sovereignty, I don't think this project will resolve it in one way or another. Although, of course, it is to be welcomed that Huawei is cooperating with European partners as well. I think actually a very important industrial policy question, maybe for the European Commission and others, is why is it the case that if we have a European sovereignty issue, we have to turn to Huawei to sort it out for us, and we don't have European players. And my question is if you look at the European Commission digital policy, for example, is even more heavy-handed regulation really the response to that? I mean, or should we rather create a more business-friendly environment in Europe if we really want to solve a problem? I'm not sure if there is a problem, but if there is a problem of European sovereignty, I think one should look at the regulatory landscape more broadly. But going back to competition, what can we say about this initiative by Huawei, which I think is generally speaking to be welcomed. I mean, first of all, it's certainly an initiative which will bring, if it does materialize, I think from what Andreas was saying, apparently it will at some point, by necessity, as one was saying as well. This will bring about a new product, a new operating system, so increase competition by not a completely new product, but something which is innovative, will have different features. And I think my first competition-specific point is how is Huawei developing it? You can have very many ways in which to develop something new, to innovate, broadly speaking. One is to keep innovation in your own silo, and I don't mean it in a pejorative way, but this is clearly what Apple does. Okay, everything is proprietary, everything is vertical integrated. Perfectly legitimate business strategy, and it works well, apparently, for Apple. Another way of doing it is to cooperate, to develop technological standards by cooperation. And if we look at the various waves of 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, and now the Internet of Things, for example, very much technological standards for interoperability are developed cooperatively by businesses disclosing their technologies, discussing technologies, disclosing their patents, the patents which may be essential to the standard. So it's a cooperative process. And then there is a truly open source project. Android was initially developed as an open source project, and as I understand it from Andreas, from what's in the public domain, the new Huawei operating system will be open source as well. Or perhaps, and so it's being developed as a mix of open source project based on Android, on the Android open source project itself, and in cooperation with European partners. So an element of cooperation, an element of open source. This is good for competition. It has to be good for competition. Secondly, providing a new source of competition to Google Android, I think it's in principle a good thing. What's going to be interesting, I think, it's a bit of a natural experiment here, because of course, going back to the Commission Google Android decision, a key issue in that decision, and one we should remind ourselves and everybody else that the decision is, of course, under appeal. So it's going to be a few years until we know for sure whether that was an infringement or not, was anti-competitive conduct or not. For the time being, it's a matter of law, and the EU law it is, but the final word has not been said yet. Going back to that decision, of course, one controversial point was where our consumers, our OEMs, our network operators really requiring, demanding Google products, Google apps, because they are a superior product, everybody really wants them, or because of anti-competitive conduct, or because of abuse of dominance by Google. And if we have a new operating system by Huawei, which cannot have pre-installed Google apps by necessity, I think, until the trade war developed in that way, Huawei was quite happy to take a license from Google of Android and of their apps. But we will really see whether it was indeed the case that Google apps were so popular because of anti-competitive, or so widespread because of anti-competitive conduct or abuse of dominance, or because there was really a benefit for consumers, because they are better products. And going back then to the divide between EU and US competition policy, simply opening up, keeping the market open, or really focusing on whether consumers benefits or not. Now, has the Google Android decision by the Commission anything to do with Huawei's project? As Wong already said, not really, no. But will it help the project? Perhaps a couple of features in the decision, yes, marginally. But I do find interesting to note that very much in the same way as the two Microsoft cases played out, so does now the Google decision, the Google Android decision by the European Commission. In reality, new sources of competition come not because of these decisions, but because of other developments in the global economy, in this case, a trade war between China and the United States. But I do want to emphasize as a concluding point that it is important that we have proper competition enforcement, because wherever competition is coming from, whatever happens, it is indeed important of keeping markets open and ensuring that everybody can compete on a level playing field. And it is true, absolutely true, that competition law should not protect competitors, but competition, as Wong said, I mean, the slogan that has been so many times repeated, and I agree that it's not just about protecting competitors, but nevertheless, if there are no competitors, there is no competition to protect either. So keeping markets open and giving everybody a fair opportunity to compete is important. I think, to conclude on this note, certainly with very strong competition enforcement in Europe, far ahead in the United States, to some extent, I think it's good. To some extent, I think these enforcement actions in Europe are not necessarily well conceived, but certainly Europe is a very competitive environment, an open environment in which Huawei can fail or succeed on its own merits, competing on the merits. And so we look forward to see how things develop. Thank you.
Nicely put, Renato. Thank you. Well, with that, we can move over to Peter Stuckmann. I'd appreciate if you try to keep to about 5 to 7 minutes. I think it's not a headache if we run a few minutes over on the session if we need to. We'll see. But in any case, you've heard a lot today, Peter, and so I'd really welcome your thoughts on it.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Yeah, thanks for having us here in this interesting discussion. So I will try to approach it, as many things have already been covered, a bit from the technology policy angle. I'm heading the 5G team in DG Connect. We are running the 5G action plan that you might know. We also had some recent initiatives on 5G cybersecurity. It was mentioned already by previous speakers. We came out with the toolbox together with member states, experts in January. And now we're also preparing a partnership. The new EU budget is coming up. We are, of course, reviewing this also in light of COVID-19, but we seen the importance of telecom networks and also of deployment infrastructure programs. We are confident that it will be play an important role also in terms of recovery. So we are now preparing a new partnership on 6G. And these kind of discussions are, of course, very interesting in this context. Because you have seen, and I think Renato mentioned the term technology sovereignty. When you look at the guidelines of the Commission, the von der Leyen guidelines, you see a lot about technology sovereignty. And we also saw it coming back in the industrial strategy that was adopted a couple of months ago. It's all about mastering technologies and in particular as regards strategic value chains. So we can either try to be leading companies. In 5G, we still have a number of companies that are leading. Or we can then be able to understand or be able to control or audit technologies so that we also have some trust in it. What was singled out in the von der Leyen guidelines was indeed to be able to set 5G standards and future 6G standards. We still have a good position for European players, and this hopefully can be continued. The role of suppliers has been underlined in the context of the 5G cybersecurity initiative, but of course devices are also important. So this of course brings us back a bit to think about devices and what happens in this environment. And here, microelectronics, these we have in both sides. We have it in the network, we have it on the devices, is of course very important for sovereignty, but also then the software bringing us to the operating systems. So in a nutshell, how we go about this technology sovereignty: where we have strength, we would like to continue to lead. Where we're lagging behind, we might want to come back. We're seeing that now in the cloud and data area, where we try to come back, or somehow get in and at least understand and have some control, some trust in it. So then moving a bit ahead in the what comes in the partnership, and there might be indeed in this partnership that we're setting up indeed opportunities in our programs that are coming up for these kind of projects, not judging this particular project, but in principle, these kind of topics are very relevant. Our approach on 6G will be indeed to leverage beyond the pure connectivity technologies to new parts of the value chain, cloud, IoT. I think Andreas mentioned it already. So we're thinking about not only about smartphones and consumer applications, we're moving into verticals and industrial applications. This is a new avenue. We also want to see, can we come back on components and devices if we're talking about areas beyond smartphones? Think about connected cars, think about industrial robots and environments where new devices or more smart devices will come. So there might be opportunities, of course, for European players. Where are we here? We are now in the last phase of the 5G PPP, so the biggest program worldwide on 5G that is now going in the last year. And there we have still now projects launched in the area of software and hardware innovation. One next opportunity will be on 17th of June, where the deadline was postponed a bit. It will now be still open until June, where on software innovation. So there might be some areas where these kind of partnerships could be proposed. And then, of course, the new partnership that is coming up on 6G. And there the idea indeed is to develop technologies for connectivity-based lead markets. Then the values discussion was interesting that Andreas mentioned. So the European values, of course, is something that people like to build on. So we're thinking about the human-centric internet. So develop the technologies for this human-centric internet, and to build trust through our values, and also then export it like GDPR thinking. Then finally, what will be important in this context will be the sustainable development goals, like greening the economy, Green Deal. So 5G and 6G as enabler for green transition, technology for reducing the carbon footprint for networks itself, and so on. So indeed, so in this area there will be opportunities for looking beyond connectivity value chains, and there might be room for initiatives like this. I can only present it as an opportunity. I don't want to judge individual proposals at this stage, of course. It's up to industry to use the opportunity, and also the different partners involved have to see how this will be taken up. And especially European partners need to see how it fits. Is there an opportunity in the area of OS with which kind of partners? And so this is what I would present as an open discussion. But of course, we take note of this as a very interesting debate. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for those very clear remarks. So the Commission is into a lot of things and is basically open, is what I think I heard. This is good. Okay, well, we're running a little later than I'd wanted to. Andreas, since an awful lot relates back to what you said, is there anything you feel a need to rebut, or should I move over to the audience questions?
Well, I can just make a few remarks if you don't mind. Just very general, because I think it might, yeah, very short, because it can possibly help us moving it forward. So I mean, I obviously I think all of your comments are fantastic. I appreciate the open discussion on this as well, obviously. So first of all, on Renato, I mean, I 100% agree. It's, you know, an approach that uses technology standards by cooperation and open source. At the same time, combining those, it's good for competition. So I 100% agree on this. With Hosuk, he said it's the result of a necessity that we are driving this. Yes and no. I mean, of course, the timing is right at the moment. However, obviously, the development, also planning, and you know, the fact that we're looking at a multi-device future and 5G happened before you know, May 16th. So yes, it's certainly related to necessity, of course, but at the same time, we look at it you know, from an opportunity point of view for Europe or the world in that sense, to create more competition, as Renato said. And then lastly, to Peter's point, technology value chains, especially 5G. I mean, Huawei also is currently the #1 supplier of handsets for 5G. Obviously, these handsets are necessary to use the standard in a commercial setting for users. So this, obviously, going back to technology value chains, makes I think this discussion also quite interesting about the operating system, since the operating system is on these devices that consumers choose to buy in great numbers. So I think it's very important to have this kind of discussion. So those are just my general comments that I just came to mind.
Okay, if I could just ask one quick clarification, which I think would be useful here. Also, some of the questions from the audience are in this direction. Do you see, for what Huawei is looking for here, do you see this mainly as a cooperative arrangement among firms, or are you looking for a strong government role?
Well, I mean, I think that the government needs to take some leadership in this, for sure. So, I mean, yes, it's a matter of partnerships for European companies, even companies outside of Europe as well, right? This type of partnership is important to make something like this work, quite simply, because you don't just create an operating system and it runs. It's a pretty significant project. But I also, you know, see definitely a need for European policy to support this kind of approach. And you know, we can see it if we look at the landscape of tech in Europe. We have around 6 million full-time developers in Europe, especially in the 3 hubs: London, Berlin, Paris. Versus the US, which has around 4 million. So we have an abundance of talent in Europe that needs to, or can be put to work on a project like this. And obviously that requires policies for this talent to operate efficiently. At the same time, we're also seeing, for example, that 90% of large-scale investments in European technology companies are made with at least one US or Asian investor, which means that actually large-scale investment within Europe is driven not just by Europe, but by investors from other parts of the world as well, which obviously poses a little bit of a risk that this technology leaves sort of our European geography here in a sense. So and obviously I think that this does require some policies to be in place. So for sure, a government needs to get involved. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to take some questions from the audience now. I've got them coming in on Slido. And actually one question that shows up from several different questioners, all of them anonymous, relates one way or another to, isn't it a bit weird to discuss European digital sovereignty based on a potential partnership with Chinese companies? Another one goes on from that to talk about how does another non-EU operating system, Chinese in this case, help European sovereignty? So I think a question for everyone on that. Renato has actually already said a bit about this. Anyone care to jump in on this one? Peter.
Yeah, that's of course an interesting question. As we just had the discussion on the 5G Cyber Toolbox, where we also talk a lot about dependencies. So of course we remain open in our markets and in our partnerships, but at the end of the day, it's of course important to see that we don't want to run into any dependencies also when we set up this new project. So this will be something that will be to be considered, but that's then also a bit the European players that will get involved might also then have a thought how this kind of ecosystem might come up. And then we're far from having going forward. So it's in the moment we would have opportunities and programs, but then these projects will have to be evaluated with a European perspective in terms of impact. So this will be, of course, closely looked at.
Thank you, Peter. Josik, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. It's odd question. It's easy to just ask the question back to the person. Can you define weird, and can you define digital sovereignty? I mean, it is first thing I want to say at the onset is that if all countries would apply strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty as an overall practice, the biggest loser will be Europe. Why? Because we participate more in other countries' value chain through our services, especially in banking and other critical sectors, rather than vice versa. We are the world's biggest exporter of services, and thereby, if we apply this, it's going to hit back at us. That's something that is undisputable, I think. But at the same time, I would really like to laud the work that the Commission is doing now, for example, on 5G Toolbox. And one of the elements it has identified is that, yes, we want to remain open, but in order to protect our critical infrastructure, we need to define not just technical measures, but also there are strategic risks that go straight to our critical infrastructure. And now here's the point. Not everything is critical. What I search online is probably not critical. I would argue that the bank errands that I do or the payment structure I use is far more critical than what I might be Googling on 3 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday or whenever. So in that sense, I think it's very important to have a very objective and well-defined criterion what we see as a threat or sovereignty. It can't just be anyone who is smarter and more successful than we are. That can't be the criteria of digital sovereignty. Basically, if that is what we're going to go for, we're going to lose in the end. But we do actually have a question, I think, that is really genuinely posed, which is a question about relationship versus China. I'm not talking about Huawei here, but I'm talking about China versus United States. Yes, it is true that there was a breach in the relationship with the US in terms of trust. And there has been also several breaches between China and Europe. We need to treat them equally, meaning that any verification and any redress that we have received from United States should be reasonably asked of also from our Chinese partners. If we want to maintain the same level of openness to the US and China, that is the least amount of actually ask that we could hope for in order to access the European market. And that has nothing to do with the commercial vendors who are probably just victims of two legal and political systems as much as the users.
Okay, thanks for that, Jose. A quick technical question, Katja. It's no problem if we run a few minutes over, I hope. The speakers can stay on for a few more minutes, I hope. Katja?
Yes, that's fine. Just go on.
Okay, good. Well, so thank you for that. I'd like to toss out one or two more questions from the audience then, just running a little over. One of them will, I think, mostly be for Andreas, since it has more to do with how things would work. Yet another anonymous question. It's what happens with must-have apps like WhatsApp in the European Union? Is new application development needed? What if the owner decides not to develop apps for the new system? So is there any obligation? I think this will be probably mostly a technical answer. Over to you, Andreas.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it goes back to the question of platforms, right? Obviously, platforms are built for providers of applications, for example, to provide their products in a sense, right? This is what we currently see, and you know, I mean, obviously, we will probably see some new business models pop up in the future around these platforms, right? And as I already said, with the usage of devices changing over time, you know, the platform also changes over time and offers new kinds of possibilities. Obviously, I cannot speculate as to which companies may or may not buy into this. However, what we can say is that for sure, companies will follow business opportunities, right? And platforms generally offer business opportunities, yeah? And what we're seeing is that people buy devices, people buy Huawei phones, right? People also buy Huawei phones if they do not have Google Play Store installed. That's what we're seeing because we're selling them. So that means that they're, you know, you can't generally just discount that people will or that companies will not join a certain initiative. So obviously a very difficult question to answer, but I hope that it's clear that if the platform you know, offers opportunity for app developers, then they will also join the effort.
Okay, and am I correct in understanding that the intent is to have a platform that Android apps could easily be ported to?
Well, in principle, yes. This is possible. It's a very technical, philosophical question, but in principle, yes. You can run that, and nowadays there are developer environments that support multi-platform development as well, and we expect that multi-platform development will also continue into the future. So.
Okay, back to the audience. Anonymous wrote a lot of questions. Yet another one, but this one goes, in a hypothetical US-EU trade war, what happens if the US prohibits companies from selling or licensing their OS to this EU market? And actually, I know, Jose, I think you've also written on this.
Well, sorry to be jack of all trades. Well, if I understood the question correctly, is the question somehow suggesting that United States would cut off its biggest investment market? US companies have an annual turnover of €1 trillion plus every year. And you would basically cut that off in order because the orange man is a little bit upset with Europe at the moment. I don't think that happens. I mean, there are a lot of people who shoot themselves in the foot in the current administration. This is basically cutting your everything below your neck. I just don't think it's going to happen. So I would say like this: if someone in the White House is listening right now and contemplating to actually embargo entire European market, I think that's a whole different ball game than trying to slow down gradually the inevitable advancement of the Chinese economy without considerable political reform. I just don't think it's gonna be done. And if someone thinks that's feasible, try my luck.
There we go. Anybody else on that one? Otherwise, I'll move on to another. There was one question from Frederick de Backer asking what might be used as a starting point for the kernel. He asked whether Linux might be a suitable starting point. Here again, I don't know if this is even settled, but I'd be interested in what the Huawei thinking is on this, and any feedback from the other panelists as well.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, I think well, our stance that you know has been also presented in the context of something called Harmony OS, which was presented last year, is a microkernel solution, which basically allows for more secure development, because you don't have a central kernel that can be attacked, but you have kind of like a distributed operating system. Now, you know, the technical details, you know, we can't really clarify here, but you know, let it be said that a decentralized microkernel operating system is more suitable for a multi-device future that we will have inevitably.
Okay, thank you. And actually, I think I'm running through most of the questions now. A few really relate to, for example, the fact that the existing applications, in fact, this one was posed mainly by Simon Hanya, who's the privacy officer at Uber. He's saying that investments in apps represent switching costs for users because people have invested effort into using them. So he's asking about portability obligations for the apps in the app store. Is this something that Europe should be thinking about? This is actually, I think, more of a question for everybody. It's not just this one's not specifically about the effort, but is that a different way to get some of the same benefits?
Well, it's interesting. If I may just jump in. I mean, it's interesting, and this goes more to a kind of the idea of regulation in order to ensure both consumer benefits and increased competition. I mean, if we think about, I mean, it's not exactly the same app portability, but if you think about number portability, right, and fixed telephony, I mean, what that meant for competition, and again, number portability in mobile telephony, again, what that means for switching. And you have the same kind of, let's say, broad approach in many industries. For example, the open banking project in the United Kingdom and more broadly in Europe also, etc. So portability of, you know, data from one bank to another, because now the bank doesn't just have your current account number and the last balance, but lots of data that are very useful for customizing services to you, etc. So you have to port that as well. The general data protection regulation and the provisions that you have there, I mean, which is by and large, right, what I would call an example of draconian and disproportionate regulation on businesses and not very useful to consumers. By and large, we do need data protection, but not of that kind. But there are some good aspects to that, and one is data portability, for example. And so indeed, if you want a more competitive market, I think app portability may be something to think about. I mean, there are difficulties as well, but something to think about. It's I think, a very good point.
Thank you. Josek, you had your hand up.
Yeah, a very quick point. Although I'm very sympathetic to the idea of having some kind of portability on apps, I mean, I'm stuck with the same ecosphere that I got when the first smartphone came out. So I'm stuck with that ecosphere forever because I have so much sunk cost in it. But I would argue the 2 points. One is that that's not really necessarily a market problem. Second is that now that we are going towards more and more freeware, it's actually less of a problem. If you look also at some of the pay apps, for example, the Office suite that many of us use, they are subscription based. So the app is free. So it's, technically speaking, it's much less of a problem. It's very often raised by people who want to basically create more regulated environment on the app space. So it's not necessarily a genuine argument at all times. And actually the key point to this, I guess, on this issue is also a question about, do we really want to have a regulation-centric internet, or do we want to have a user-centric internet? And that's, I think, really the dividing point when it comes to how we want to actually create the space. Because in the end, if you force companies to follow a certain standard, a file format, or any kind of portability, really, what you basically create is that you stop innovation. And the route that we have taken so far, when we have a dominant player in EU competition case law, is that we have forced the dominant player to open up its standards. So, for example, in the Reuters case, smaller players wanted to really have access to the Reuters core in order to create apps, and Reuters refused to share it on the basis that basically saying it was IP. But DG Comp, in its infinite wisdom, actually forced them to open up rather than creating a forced standardization. So we need to maintain a competition between standards. That's essential, I think, for any kind of innovation in this space.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think we should be working to wind this down. I'd like to first give people an opportunity to make quick closing remarks if there's anything that you missed in the course of the session today. And we'll do that in the same order that we did the original interventions, if we might. Andreas, anything we missed?
Sorry, I was muted. No, I don't think so. I would just like to reiterate, our opinion that the current situation also poses a big opportunity for Europe to take on a little more independence, right? And also to utilize all of the great tools that we have in Europe, in terms of talent, in terms of investment that we can make into the local tech community. All we need is a platform that we can have sovereignty over within Europe and be able to contribute to that.
Thank you, Andreas. Jose, anything we missed on your side? You've already said a lot.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna say much. I'm just gonna congratulate Huawei for making this step. I think it really shows that there was no really significant barrier to market entry in Europe. So I congratulate Europe to that. And whatever comes after that is basically, whether you're talking about digital sovereignty or if you're talking about privacy issues, whatever we ask for ourselves, we should ask for of others, and vice versa. So whatever we demanded from the United States or China, for that matter, in terms of security parameters, it should also apply across the board. We just need to figure out how critical is the operating system as such. I mean, there's a lot of data going through there, but you can't launch any nuclear arms with it. And so it sits somewhere there in between. Thanks.
Good thought. Okay, Renato.
Just a quick concluding remark, again, from a broader policy perspective and maybe competition policy perspective. I think this Huawei new initiative really shows the market forces in action and teaches us that very often what unleashes these market forces is not competition intervention and competition cases, but things that we may not expect at some point. when cases are taken, when cases are decided. I'm again thinking particularly about Google Android, but if you look at the Microsoft cases, you know, the time of Windows with Media Player, the time of Windows with Internet Explorer, there was at some point a theory that through the web there would be new PC operating systems displacing Windows. In reality, the reason why Microsoft now is in a much more competitive environment is not because Windows has been displaced through software platforms operating through media players or web browsers, but because there are different ecosystems competing in different ways, in different spaces among each other. So Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, maybe Huawei now as well. And the job of competition policy should be more modestly just to keep markets open, to intervene surgically, so to speak, when there is a specific problem. But what really will work, I think, is the market. And as Wong said as well, I wish, so my wish to Huawei is that their project may succeed or fail based on efficiency, innovation, and competition on the merits, and not anything else like government intervention, for example, or other things. I think there is always a role for government. I mean, I'm not one of those who advocate for the abolition of government, not at all. I think in this space, government should intervene in certain cases, but I hope that this project will succeed or fail based on market forces, not on government sponsorship. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Renato. So I think you and Josek both made a pretty strong message that government should be careful not to over-intervene. I don't necessarily think that government opposes that, but with that, over to Peter Stuckmann from the Commission.
Yes, Scott. First, I take the opportunity to clarify that from the audience, there was a question on if we would close markets. So digital sovereignty doesn't mean that our markets don't remain open. It's about mastering technologies and also, if possible, have some stakes and some success in all important areas of the value chain. Yeah, on intervention, indeed, that's why I'm a bit careful. I say we are open to partnerships. We actually giving opportunities with our programs to make this happen or to facilitate these things. But we certainly, and this sounds already a bit from other speakers that this is congratulating, this is now the new thing. Of course, we have this these ideas on the table. It can be one of others as well. And we wouldn't be in the position to pick a winner at this stage and to say this is now the route we're going. That they're a bit more hands off and facilitate and say if the partners also in Europe see this as an opportunity, we can see and see how it evolves. But also keeping in mind, as we say, that it's a very diverse landscape. It's not only about only replacing or having a third operating system on smartphones, which we already thought about since many years, and there were tries on, for example, search engines to create a European search engine and so on. So this is, yeah, normally very difficult to do. So we would rather say, let's look at how these ecosystems evolve, that look at the new types of devices that are coming, industrial environments, industrial platforms, and then see what the opportunities will be there, and then have new possibilities in Europe to make this possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So with that, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank these terrific speakers. These were very, very thoughtful interventions. I'm sorry you don't get to hear the audience clap, but I will. Thank you very much to all of you for taking the time to do this and for giving us the benefit of your very, very wise thoughts. And with that, I would like to close this panel on an alternative mobile operating environment. I'd like to remind all of you in the audience that Bruegel holds a lot of these events now, even more than we used to hold physically. So keep your eye on the Bruegel events page. And with that, goodbye for today. Thanks again to the speakers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thanks to everyone.